If you've played the map Countryside in Hill Climb Racing 2, you've probably noticed these barns, and there are quite a few. 17 to be exact, if we're only counting the ones before the 10,000 meter mark and excluding the ones in the background that we pass. I'm sure you've wondered this before, but are these barns realistic? Today, we're going to try to figure that out. The Google definition of a barn is a large farm building used for storing grain, hay, or straw, or for housing livestock. None of the first 17 barns are obviously storing grain, hay, or straw, and they also don't appear to be the homes of any animals. But I think there's more to it than just the definition. I mean, they have to be read too, right? Anyway, I made a small list to help us properly classify if the in-game barns are like real-life barns. On first glance, we're off to a good start. Both are red, and even though the hex values are different, I think we can let that slide. Also, each barn has an entrance, and each barn has windows. But you're not supposed to judge a book by its cover, or a barn by its color. According to extremepolebuildings.net, the most common residential pole barn size is 24 by 24, and the most common commercial pole barn size will be in the range of 30 by 40. That's great. Now we have a reference point, we just need to get the dimensions of a countryside barn. To keep this simple, I'm just going to measure the length and the height. The best way I could think of doing this was driving a vehicle from one end of the barn floor to the other. So I got in the tractor, of course, and drove to the first barn in Countryside, which is just after 3,200 meters. I slowly drove from the left end, which started at 3,227 meters, to the right end, which stopped at 3,245 meters. The difference between those two is 18 meters, meaning the barn floor across is 18 meters. I don't know if this is the length or the width though, and I was trying to use the door as a reference point and compare it to a real barn, but you don't actually enter through what I thought was the door. It doesn't matter. The length or the width of this barn is almost 60 feet, which is slightly higher than the 30 by 40 range. I then went to this website that lets you measure any part of an image based on an original distance. So based on the barn floor being 18 meters, these rocks are about 4 meters long, which seems kind of suspicious, but whatever. This is useful because we can then approximate the barn height below the roof to be 9.6 meters, or about 31 feet, which actually falls in the normal range of a 2-story pole barn. Apparently they're called pole barns because in the 1930s, farmers needed to save money when building their barns, and they used utility poles. Anyway, despite the dimensions of the countryside barn being slightly weird, and the first and second floors being exact copies, everything is feasible enough so far. Maybe this is just some new barn update that only a few people have. You know, like the rolling updates HCR2 has. Before, we looked at the Google definition of a barn, but I don't think that's good enough. So I found Title 7 of the United States Code, Section 2008-0. I'm trying to make this sound fancy, but I just searched barn legal definition on Google, and this is what I got. A building can be considered a barn if it's on a farm and does one or more of the following: house animals, store crops, store agricultural equipment, or is useful to the farm. And it's red. It definitely said that too. With that in mind, let's take a look at the inside of the barn. When I drove along the bottom floor earlier to find its length, we could see that one tractor could easily be stored there. So this barn could be used for storing agricultural equipment. Actually, this barn can comfortably store 4 tractors, and tractors are quite useful on farms. For example, they can be used to pull equipment like a wagon or a plow. The only problem is that I don't see any evidence that indicates a tractor or another vehicle is actually being stored here. I was simply driving through the barn, not refueling or doing something that could be considered essential to the farm. Another thing that's relevant to farms and barns is farm animals. In Countryside, the only obvious animals are cows. Now, cows near the barns are good because the first item in the legal definition of a barn is housing animals. Unfortunately, there aren't any cows physically inside the barns as you drive past, but oftentimes they're either very close or a couple hundred meters away. In real life, cows generally have a large grazing area, which can be more than an acre, so it's reasonable that they wouldn't be so close to the barn. It's also a good sign that there are bales of hay near the barns, as cows eat things like grass, grains, and hay. If we look at the inside of the barn again, we already know a bunch of tractors will fit. As I'm driving, if we compare the size of the cows to the size of the tractor, they look similar enough. But I'm driving on one path, and because the cows don't move or anything, we know that they aren't exactly on the same path. The only reason I bring this up is because the difference in depth between the tractor and the cow might mess up my perspective on how large they are. Even if depth wasn't an issue, something isn't adding up. Like surely our barn that is at least as big as an average 2-story barn should be able to hold more than 4 cows. I was going to look more into this and try to figure out the square footage of our barn, but we don't care how realistic the cows are, we only care about the barns. So, cows, a barn, and hay all within 100 meters. I don't think this is conclusive evidence that the cows belong to any of the barns, and we can therefore say that the barns are realistic, but I think it's a pretty good sign. Next, I want to look at the distance between each barn. There is a lot of variability here, but that's fine. We don't need precision like we did for the dimensions of the barn. Starting at the end of the first barn, 3,245 meters, it takes under 1 minute to reach the next barn at 3,450 meters, which is a trip of just over 200 meters. This seems really close given that people can own tens of acres surrounding their barn. Initially, I thought that each barn would belong to a different person or family, but 200 meters is 0.049 acres. Such a small distance between barns makes me think that only one person owns both of them, which isn't so uncommon to have two barns. If we keep driving, the next barn is under 300 meters away, which still isn't even a tenth of an acre away. Maybe this guy owns 3 barns, but I'm sure you're starting to see the problem. If we go a lot further, the distance between the 11th and 12th barns is the furthest out of any other barn pair, but even then, it's only a difference of about 1,500 meters, which is still less than half an acre, which is probably not representative of how far apart 2 farming neighbors would actually be. I think this has to mean that every single barn in the 10,000 meter range is owned by the same person. If that is the case, it explains why they're quite close together. That also answers another question. Why does every single barn look exactly the same? For a moment, let's say that each barn is actually owned by a different person. If they were built at the same time by the same people, there would still be some variability. I guess this logic isn't really checking out because you could say the same thing even if it was one person who owns all of them. So, this isn't great. Okay, but does this then mean that one single person owns all 17 barns? Why would anyone ever do that? Surprisingly, I couldn't find someone online who had this experience, so I had to turn to my friend Grok. Okay, but I need answers. At first, I thought about the cows. There are around 300 in this first 10,000 meters. 300 cows split into 17 barns comes out to be about 18 cows per barn. Earlier, it seemed like we could only fit 4 cows into each barn. Maybe you can fit in a few more though. I'm going to stretch it a bit, but let's just say that we can do double what I originally thought. I still just don't see how we can get from 8 to 18. Okay, even if we ignore all of these unanswered questions, there is one last problem. With 300 cows and 17 barns, you'd be producing way too much stuff, whether it's beef or milk or whatever else. So surely, some of the goods would have to be sold somewhere. It's possible the items are sold to some big company or whatever, but I can't prove that. And the next best thing that I could think of is that the barn owners would sell to a nearby town. Now, most of you watching this video probably play HCR2, and you might be thinking, there's no town in Countryside. And for that matter, there's no town in any other part of the game. But what if there actually is, and we just can't see it? This is what I mean. We only looked at the first 10,000 meters, which is just over 6 miles, but a town can be 10 miles away from a farm, or even more. Of course, you can drive past the 10K mark. People have done that. They've gone much further, just not with a tractor. I wonder if the glider is a good farm vehicle. But tens of thousands of meters later, there is still no town. However, that's only if we're traveling to the right. At the beginning of the map, the invisible wall doesn't let you go to the left. But what if at the beginning of the map, we're starting at the edge of town and we just can't see it? It would actually make sense because you always start with a full tank of gas, so there must have been some station to fill up at before starting the map. If that's the case, then the stuff from the 300 cows and 17 barns can actually be sold. So, are Hill Climb Racing 2's barns realistic? I'm actually going to say yes. While my town theory is interesting, to me at least, I don't have any hard evidence, and even if it was true, I think it makes more sense to go by the legal definition of a barn that we looked at before. We're just going to assume that Countryside does count as a farm, and I know that's a bit of a large assumption, but from there, with the number of cows within a reasonable proximity to the barns, in addition to the nearby hay bales and grass for cows to eat, they probably live there. Oh yeah, and it's red. Can't forget that. I wanted to ask someone reliable though, like someone who could actually determine if this type of thing was realistic. I know a guy who's been real helpful in the past. Well, somewhat helpful, I guess. Anyway, I asked Grok the same question based on my findings, and here was the response. There is superficial realism. The red colors, doors, and windows match common expectations of a barn. The size is possible even though it's larger than average, and the interior can fit multiple tractors which back up the legal definition storage-wise, and finally, the cows are also a good sign. But all of this is not enough to ignore the major and unrealistic flaws. So here is the list. There are too many barns, and they're way too close together. All of the barns look exactly the same. The barns are empty inside, And the whole thing is economically absurd because there are too many cows and too many barns with no place to sell the goods. It all feels like a stretch. What I'm hearing is that I was right all along though, and you can't judge a barn by its color. But I guess I was kind of doing that the whole video. Anyway, that's all I've got, and I'd love to know what you guys think. Thanks so much for watching. Bye.